creating a costume piece, Project A, from start to finish. We started things off with 12 gauge wire, measurements, and tools, and started bending a rough skeleton of our shoulder piece, starting with the neck and chest boundaries, looping the ends of the material in order to attach it to itself, and locking things down with placeholder tape because things always slide around towards the beginning of a project like this. We then went ahead and reinforced everything with 15 gauge aluminum wire in order to eliminate the need for placeholder tape and make this thing sturdy. We then set about trying to figure out a way to add a closure system to the back, which is something that I've always skimped on with past projects like this. The idea was to add a hinge system in the back through which I could pass lace and lace this thing to my body. So I added extra support beams, I added swinging arms, and then I wrapped the support beams with the same aluminum wire in order to support the swinging arms. Then I tested out the lacing system and realized very quickly that it was not going to work because of entanglement problems. So I switched gears and tried a latch system, which also was a pain in the butt, so I got rid of that too. Thus completing my abandonment of the closure system. When all was said and done, it was not necessary. So then it was time to move on to embellishing the front, and I decided to start by adding a bunch of vertical bars to the costume, using a slightly smaller 14 gauge steel wire. At this point, it was time to really start to get my embellishment hands dirty with our 15 gauge aluminum wire by creating an X pattern that was a little tough at first, but we got it eventually. Figured out a pattern that incorporated the intertwining of these X's, locked that down, and then went to town. Xing, and Xing, and Xing, and Xing until we were done. And what a painstaking process it was, but it pales in comparison to what came next. We took some 18 gauge black aluminum wire and set about figuring out a way to take the embellishment further. And I tried a couple of things, got rid of that, and then ultimately landed on the most time-consuming idea that I could have possibly landed on. And once I had a proof of concept, I set about realizing this idea, which was wrapping the entire costume in teeny tiny thin black spirals. So I wrapped, and 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 I wrapped until the whole thing was covered with thousands of these spirals. This was a doozy, but totally worth it in my opinion. And then it was time to make our companion piece, a crown, starting again with our thick steel wire, bending it to the rough shape that I want, and then into our slightly thinner wire in order to reinforce the big thick stuff. We ended up adopting a couple of different ways of doing this, with tape and wire and all kinds of things in order to get it stable enough to bend and shape into the form that I wanted. I then went ahead and added a bunch of vertical bars similar to the shoulder piece, and then had to twist it and turn it and prod it and poke it in order to get it as even as possible. And then it was time to get rid of the need for placeholder tape by this time wrapping the whole thing in thin, tight black coils. I then went ahead and divided the crown in two by adding a wire down the center, two wires actually wrapped together, looped through the centerpiece, dividing the crown, and leaving it primed for the next step, which is the addition of X embellishment once more, using the thin, slightly thicker black aluminum wire 15 gauge. Executing first a proof of concept, and then going ahead and diving into filling the whole thing in with X's. It was then time to do once again what I had done with the shoulder piece and wrap the entire thing, this time with silver thin aluminum wire. I was going for an inversion of colors here. And then it was time to move on to the final step, which was the bedazzlement of the entire thing, with tons and tons of black and clear gems placed in strategic locations, and using hot glue, which was definitely not the best material, and I probably will not be using it again in the future, but it got the job done this time. And this was another marathon of bedazzlement. But once again, 100% worth it. This really tipped the project over the edge. And then I went ahead and bedazzled the crown as well, with big gems mostly, and thus completed the Costume A extravaganza. All in all, this was about 2.5 months worth of work, averaging about an hour and a half per day. But it is done, we got there, and thank you very much for watching.